Okay, welcome to Inside Out, mental health at work and in life, where we're exploring why our workplaces feel the way they do and what it takes to build cultures that support genuine well-being. I'm your host, Catherine Eady, and today I'm joined by Iain. Welcome to the show. Before we dive into the topic of mental health at work and in life, though, for people meeting you for the first time, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am Iain Kennedy, obviously. I am the Health and Safety Manager in the Western General Hospital. I work for the University of Edinburgh, and I have been very interested in mental health and mental health first aid for quite some time now. And yes, it's something that I'm quite passionate about and that I can support with.
Excellent. So, the very topic, you've been a mental health first aider, you've done a course with us, you've kind of been on the ground supporting people in the workplace. So, the key question that we start with really is when you think about a mentally healthier workplace, what do you think that actually looks like in practice?
Yeah, I suppose it can take quite a few different forms. So I think there's a lot that a workplace could do to support uh, staff and student and visitor mental health in general. It's difficult because I've worked with the same organisation for quite some time, and I do think we do have a lot of systems in place that work very well that support mental health in the workplace. But to reflect upon what would be some of those good things would be a general awareness of the importance of mental health and the fact that we all have mental health, that our mental health can fluctuate quite significantly over time. It's not something that we just leave at home or leave in work. There's a clear interaction. You quite often when you go home, you think about work and you really work. If you're like me, you're thinking about wanting to go home. So these two things uh, tend to overlap. We don't leave our problems, at the doorstep. So trying to understand and pick that apart can be, I think, challenging for workplaces. But there's a lot of things that they can do to support mental health. Removing stigma is one, I think, an important one that we're getting better at doing in the UK in general and in workplaces, but just promoting mental health and being more aware of it. I think that can be challenging sometimes because it feels like maybe an organisation might be promoting something that might be perceived as being like a plaster for a bigger issue, if you will, or just whitewashing it, for want of a better expression. But I think it is important for raising awareness. Also having systems in place for supporting individuals when they're struggling. So, and also, which quite commonly overlooked, is having systems in place to try and what's the word I'm looking for, to proactively encourage mental health before it becomes an issue. So I think quite often a lot of workplaces are quite reactive, and that is something that certainly the health and safety executive have looked at recently in some establishments and highlighted that it is quite a reactive process quite often in organisations. I think there's lots of different things you can do. We could probably speak about it all day, to be honest with you. But we do have a lot of our committees locally, including a wellbeing committee, which can be quite good in promoting mental health. It's not the be all to end all. I think a lot of it rests with management and awareness and training and support, reasonable adjustments. There's lots of different facets that come into it. So I'm probably going over the top in the explanation, but maybe you want to reel it in a little
No, that's absolutely fine, Ian. And just to pick up on something you mentioned there about health and safety executive, which ties in with the kind of next question. But the recent statistics, I pulled I did a comparison of the last 7 years of the health and safety executive stress, anxiety and depression report. And of course, they're self-reporting. They're giving us a broad picture. They're not telling us everything. And yes, the statistics are what they are. But
bit.
it's interesting to see that we're at, I mean, the irony is we're not, we're at the worst state we have been in those statistics. So, where do you see organizations getting stuck right now if we're seeing those figures not improving?
Yeah, I think it's quite a daunting task. I think sometimes for organisations to deal with. I mean, the HSE are specifically looking at stress here. They do look at lots of other factors as well, but stress is what they're looking at predominantly, and they've got quite a focus on that at the moment. It is quite a difficult subject to tackle, and I think it's difficult for a number of reasons. One is because maybe there used to be quite a lot of misconceptions around stress, particularly in higher education and other sectors where, it was seen as being a positive thing. If you weren't stressed in your job, then, you either, weren't doing your job properly, or basically there wasn't enough work for you, and you needed to have more work. And, we've heard, particularly things like academia, a lot of people mention, that you have to publish scientific papers or publish or die is quite often something that we hear. So there is a lot of assumption, I think, that stress is a good thing, and it can be a good thing. When we're placed under a reasonable amount of stress, you can perform in a more successful way, or you might be able to accomplish tasks better. It can be good, but when it obviously becomes too prolonged or it becomes too difficult for the individual, and every individual is difficult, then it becomes a real challenge. So it's trying to, I guess, remove the stigma and educate people would be the first step, maybe, and to better understand. And I think that can be a barrier to, well, how do we tackle this mammoth thing? Are we, by trying to tackle it, are we suggesting that people, maybe don't work as hard as they should be working, or that maybe we're moving work away from people, and how are we going to manage that as an organization? Because we're paying people to come into work to do this work. So, I think it raises a lot of questions. And I don't think it's that people don't want to tackle it. They're maybe sometimes just not sure how to. I think that is a big barrier in the workplace. And there is a lot of great information out there, but it is also difficult. Risk assessments, I feel, coming from a health and safety professional, I think they can be quite difficult to do when you have something you've not done before, something you're not familiar with. And stress risk assessment is certainly something that is a legal requirement, but not a lot of people have a great deal of experience doing. So if you're asking a manager to do a stress risk assessment for their team, or somebody quite senior, then I think that is quite a challenge. So without the sort of skills and training and information to allow them to do that and to do it in a way that works for them and the team and the organisation is very difficult hurdle, I think, initially to get over.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think the Health and Safety Executive's own website has been improved in relation to helping people understand how to do those assessments and what that looks like for different sizes of organisations. So, yeah, I think a good starting point is if any organisation is listening to this and is getting stuck, that's a good place to start. Is you're getting in touch with somebody like the Health and Safety Executive and saying, we need a hand with this as well. Maybe there's not enough people reaching out for support with these types of things that could help them get unstuck.
Yeah,
essentially. So, what pressures or blind spots do you wish leaders paid more attention to?
probably quite a few. Today's, I think, would be the number one. It's something that keeps coming up, but it can't be a blind spot for all the reasons that I mentioned. Just a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding about it as well. But I guess other blind spots can be, what is a reasonable adjustment and how can it be implemented? I think a lot of organisations, both external and internal, are doing a lot of work on this at the moment, and that really helps to drive what is a reasonable adjustment that somebody might need to accommodate them to be able to work. And as you know, there's good evidence demonstrating, sometimes remaining in work is actually the best solution. So what can we do to help people to remain in work, and what sort of adjustments can we put in place to help those individuals? And it might not be, again, going back to the managers, if you're in a big organisation, that might, and your organisation's remit, fall within the line manager's responsibility. And if that line manager doesn't know what can and can't be done, what is reasonable, what is not reasonable, and what support might be available to explore all those different options, it can again be quite a barrier and cause things to get stuck. Similarly, for the staff members reaching out to get support for any sort of difficulty they might be facing in the workplace. So looking at another value, I think, because you can get situations where people may have had different experiences which can impact on each other and then result in them either maybe not opening up or reaching out for that support that they would really benefit from because somebody else has told them they didn't have that experience. So it can be also a value too, and anything that an organisation would do to overcome that, I think is helpful. Yes.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That I wrote a post recently on LinkedIn about, well, who supports the managers as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
You know, that there's something around, we're asking a lot of leaders and managers, and who is also supporting them rather than setting everything for them to feel. With implementing a lot of this stuff we're talking about, they need support as well to do that. And who is supporting them? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very challenging because I think there's more and more expectations of the things that managers should do. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not old enough to know if that's the way it's always worked, but or maybe it just wasn't happening as well in the past. But quite often a manager now has to wear so many different hats. They need to be an expert in finance, they need to be an expert in safety, they need to be an expert in reasonable adjustments, and they need to be understand research culture and all these different facets. And where there's a time for them to be able to do that in their day. And it's not, at least what I feel is that it's not that people don't want to do this. There's a big conflict between how they perform their role and how they're able to do these other things with support from staff. And sometimes maybe staff feel that their line manager isn't meeting that expectation, but that's maybe because the line manager feels that they're not meeting their expectation to do the things that they've been hired to do. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that is that I can't help feeling that there'll be managers going into work who themselves have poor mental health. And the knock-on and ripple effect of their poor mental health that has on others in them trying to do an adjustment for someone else who is challenged with their mental health. The manager then feels that their focus needs to be on the person they line manage and support, and therefore their mental health and well-being is it's in the back seat, really. So yeah.
And there's also a lot of colleagues, I think, as well, that try and support each other by putting additional pressures on themselves, to support people that might be struggling. And then that also has an impact on their health, whether or not that be additional workload or additional support, or it can be challenging for an organisation. I think that's a lot of hidden things that maybe go on that aren't really measurable that occur in the background that make it quite difficult to gather the full extent of the issue or what you're seeing or how you might address that. Because ultimately, people when they're healthier and happier or able to perform better in the workplace and they feel more rewarded from that. Yeah. So there's things in place that can be, a lot of things can be missed.
Yeah. They have better relationships as well. I think when people are struggling, they tend to kind of withdraw. They don't have as good conversations with their colleagues. They maybe tend to be irritable, frustrated, and they can be seen to be just someone who, that manager's always in a bad mood, or that manager's always, impatient or whatever. But actually, we're not seeing what's behind those behaviours, are we? So, yeah. Which leads us very nicely on to kind of, how has your own experience shaped the way you think about mental health at work?
That's an interesting one, and I think it's shaped it a lot. I personally feel that empathy is extremely important, but I also feel that if you've not experienced something, it can be difficult to truly associate with it. So I think that is a wider challenge. You can give somebody training, shall we say, on certain factors, and it doesn't mean to say that they'll fully understand it. And they may be, I think it's actually more beneficial if they know somebody or they've lived it themselves, so they can actually have some empathy and full understanding of that. And I guess what I mean is that, it's you quite often find that many of the mental health first aiders, at least that I've spoken to, have had challenges with either somebody they know or themselves. And that's why they're interested in it, because they want to support others and they want to know more about it. And I think that makes them quite empathetic individuals that are a good source of that first initial confidential conversation we have with them. And I do feel that, like I mentioned already, that people, people are not bad. People we naturally, want to work together, want to help each other. I think sometimes people just don't fully understand or fully appreciate that. And it's not really care, it's just that they don't understand. And, my experiences of, for example, I've had depression when I was younger. I've got a few uh, friends that have committed suicide. I've had these challenges, I think, that have impacted me and allowed me to be more empathetic and to fully appreciate that everybody's different. And you don't know what somebody might be going through until you actually sit down and have a conversation with them. Some people are very good at putting on a happy face. Other people, they seem like they could be very upset when they're actually not. Everybody's different. So it really is, if you're able to approach that in a way where, with empathy and with openness and with an attitude of support, I think it can make a big difference.
Yeah, it does add another layer. I think it's not to say that there are certainly people who maybe haven't been through it or know people can't be, but I think there's maybe a bigger piece of understanding and education and reflection needed. Whereas those that have either been in it or loved ones, that there's just that additional thing that they can bring to that role and that support that they provide. So yeah, absolutely. So what do you think helps workplaces move from tick boxing to real culture change? Tick boxing is something I talk about an awful lot. It's one of my bugbears. But yeah, what? I mean, there's a point where organisations go, right, get this booked, get this training in, or whatever, get this assessment done. Then that's us. We're sorted. Yeah. What are your thoughts on moving from tick boxing?
Well, if you talk about kickboxing all the time, then I talk about culture all the time. So we're going to be here all day. So in health and safety, there's definitions about culture and positive and negative cultures and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, culture is something that essentially is how an organization sort of, their values and their perceptions and how that turns into sort of actions. And that is something that is very difficult and challenging to change. And ultimately, it's something that takes a long time to change. So even with the best intents and good action plans and that, it does take time to change. So that in itself could be quite challenging, especially when there's pressure from people. They want to see that change. And certainly in terms of health and safety, we're at the front line because we're saying, things should be done this way for safety, but then that's not always how people want to do it or they perceive it as being useful. So ultimately, it takes a lot of time to chip away at those kind of barriers. So I think this is a big challenge, change the culture of a workplace. If you have a workplace that doesn't have any of these things in place and then you come and do the training, I agree that it might be done initially as a tick box, or we better do something about this. It's the afterwards, I think, it's really important. What simple steps can you put in place to have some traction that can move towards improving the culture or the availability of support in the workplace? So when I was initially trained as a mental health first aider, went and did the training. This is great. This is really useful. And then once I'd finished and met with a few other mental health first aiders, the question was, well, what do we do now? Has anybody heard anything about what the next steps are? And there wasn't any follow up. There wasn't any plans for what to do next. So I chatted to my line manager, and she chatted with her line manager, and I've expressed an interest in putting in place some operational guidance for the mental health first aiders to support them to do that role, together with some one source of where one location where we could have originally started as a guidance document for mental health and what is it, how can we look after, what things can we do, and that's kind of developed over the years into a separate kind of standalone website, which is not what we're talking about here. But I think it's a small steps to think, well, what is the plan next? What can we do to make this training have an impact on the organisation? How can we make people aware that those individuals are there? How can we support the mental health first aiders in their role? Because that also is something to consider, skill paid, who they're speaking to, what the expectations is, what support is available. Starting off simple and working the way up from there, I think, will eventually result in some change. It's not going to change the entire culture of the organisation, but it's these small steps in the right direction that will make eventually a difference over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly what we encourage is the consistency, small steps, the question of what now after the training, and what kind of things you can put in place and keep those initiatives going. I think what we find is as soon as the kind of any main person who's been leading on this leaves an organization and someone else comes in, that almost needs to be rebuilt again. So that can be a challenge for organizations because someone who's left, who's been leading on what happens after the training goes, and you're left with no handover.
It's a big challenge, and again, I think it comes back to like we talked about stress risk assessment. It's about people. They're concerned, I guess, they're maybe not confident enough to be doing these roles. Sometimes all it takes is just kind of jumping into it and doing their best, because I mentioned this to all the other mental health first aiders. We do at the moment what I call peer-to-peer sort of support training. So we get together regularly and we cover a subject that's in our group, but just as a kind of refresher, and we chat a little bit about that subject, and we chat about if there's anybody what things are coming up, anybody need any support, has anybody come to you for support? It's obviously a very confidential thing. But going back to what I was saying, sorry, I'm digress, was that what I say to the mental health first aiders is that I've had the same thing in you guys. I've not had any further expert training than you have. I'm not an expert in this matter. I know the same you do. Together, if we don't know the answer, we'll work it out. We'll find somebody who can support us. And quite often, as you know yourself, the mental health first aiders are to listen and to signposts and to try. The way I see it is to try and remove stigma and promote mental health in the workplace. And you don't need to be an expert to do that. Fair enough if you want a large organisation to have an expert to do that, fantastic. But at a local level, there's lots of little things you can do to help improve things. You're not going to fix any of the problems, perhaps, but you're going to support people. You're going to reduce the risk, and you're going to create a step towards a positive culture.
But it goes back to what you said earlier, empathy. The basis of it is communication. I always talk about empathy, being kind, being caring, and having a genuine interest in looking out for other people.
Yeah.
That's at the core of it, really. And you're right. It's nothing about being an expert at all. It's about having compassion and kindness, and listening to people. Yeah. So, if you could change one thing that would improve people's daily working lives, what would that be?
Another good question. With my health and safety hat on, I quite often think that people don't do too much work without having a break, without stepping away. I think mentally and also in terms of workplace risk, you don't take a little 5 minute break away from what you're doing every hour, then it might not seem like a lot, but it can have a big impact on how you perform in the workplace, how you feel mentally, and also the safety aspects of the work that you're doing. So, I quite often say to people in induction when we talk about this, well, it doesn't mean to say that the health and safety team are telling you to go away and get a cup of coffee and a pastry every hour at the cafe. What it means is maybe just putting your pets or your tools down and going having a walk, going to the toilet, going to the printer, going to get some water, getting up, stretching, moving away from the workstation, chatting to your colleague, connecting in that kind of way. Uh, it's again going back to the maybe the culture. People feel that if you're not always working, then you're not doing your job. And I think there's ways we can do our job very effectively, but also have connections and not be huddled, arched over the computer with tight shoulders all the time, typing away or working away. I think there's definitely, in order to ensure positive mental health and well-being, we need to have that, a balance between them. I do think that's key. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
is something I think that the workplace can do. And I think whereas going back to concerns around these sort of things is that I think if they feel to send around a message saying, you should make sure you have regular sort of stepping away from your workstation or your work or whatever, then people will perceive it as woohoo, we can do whatever we kind of want sort of thing. But I don't think people will behave that way. I think it's maybe a concern that's perhaps unfounded.
yeah, it's extremes. Yeah, it's kind of two extremes. Yeah, you're kind of not thinking a bit more in the middle. You're thinking kind of it's too far one way versus the other way. And I think what was interesting from what you've said around that is when we had our network event yesterday, bear in mind it started at 12 noon midday. Potentially people have maybe started at 8, maybe 9 o'clock, maybe if people are flexible working, maybe 10. And by 12 o'clock, when we arrived at the network session, I always ask people how they're feeling inputting a word cloud, completely anonymous. But it's amazing by 12 o'clock how many words were around exhaustion, tired, poor sleep, fatigue. And I looked at that and thought, we're only at midday. If that's how people are feeling at midday, how are they going to feel by the time it gets to tea time?
Yeah, totally. And there's a lot of people that take their work home as well. It's difficult to disconnect, as we talked about earlier. So, you know, I think when you're at home and you're thinking about work, that's not a good sign, but it's natural as well, because it does. You spend half of your life almost in work, and then half you spend sleeping, unless you've got a small child like I do. But it's so yes, it's no wonder that if you're thinking about work when you're at home, you're coming in and you're trying to rush about doing all the work, that you're going to be fatigued. And having a small little break can definitely help. I sometimes I don't take it to the extreme, but I've got a habit of going to the gym or going to a jog at lunchtime, and that doesn't work for 99% of the population. It works for me, but having that break, I find in that middle of that day really does help me, because if there's been times when I've worked through that lunch break and just continue to work, that's had an impact on my work certainly by the end of the day, how I feel at the end of the night. I find it harder to disconnect. And then that has an impact on the work I do the next day. So it all has a knock on effect. So those little kind of breaks
Yeah, yeah,
really, and there is a lot of encouragement for that, certainly from, well-being, but also from people like the HSE and stuff like that.
yeah. Well, remember, everyone listening, absolutely, it can be the smallest thing. I think we maybe think often many people think too big. It needs to be a big thing, but no, those 5-10 minute breaks. And ironically, after an hour and a half at yesterday's network session, when we redid the word cloud, there was that sense of feeling relaxed, and people had taken that time out, although it's a longer time out than they maybe would normally have taken. But I think it demonstrated that exact thing you're talking about, is give yourself a break, make sure it's regular, keep it consistent. I think people can start with good intentions and then
Yeah,
they let it slide,
yeah, totally.
you know?
Is it 30 days builds a kind of habit or something like that? I can't remember, but
Yes.
I feel with the lunchtime breaks, I mentioned the exercise. It was that I'm kind of just in a routine of doing that now. So I think if you could get in a routine of maybe taking a 5 minute break in between, just say you start with 9 and you don't have a break for 12, maybe if you were to take 5 minutes, 2 hours or something like that, go and stretch your legs and chat with one of your colleagues or whatever, then that you can get in the routine of doing that, then that you might notice a small change with
Yeah.
your.
Yeah, I think it can make a good difference. So, kind of coming towards the end, but for people who hold influence, what do you think using it well looks like?
So I think talking the talk is something that you'll have heard of before. It's certainly big in terms of health and safety. There's I think some leaders underestimate the clout, if you will, that they have, and the influence they have over others. Sometimes all it can take in simple terms is asking them to relay a message, and that has huge benefits because it comes from them. Certainly in the health and safety world, I experience it a lot. If I send an email, probably goes in everybody's spam inbox. Whereas, if it comes from a director, then it will be read and it will be adhered to, not always in every situation, but it certainly has a much bigger impact.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of simple things we can do, even if it involves that senior leader speaking to somebody that maybe has been trained as a mental health first aider or who is responsible for well-being or whatever it might be, and asking how they can support or vice versa. Listening to the person that's asking for them to send out a message or for them to give some physical or support to any sort of initiative or whatever it might be, then that will have a much bigger impact. And over time, that just becomes then the norm in the organisation, and then that has a massive impact.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely these senior leaders will drive those cultural changes. So it can be challenging to get senior leaders sometimes to be on board with that. Not because they don't want to be on board, but because they've got so many responsibilities, as part of their role. So, if there was any senior leaders out there, I would encourage them to speak to those individuals in the team, because it doesn't take much. It doesn't need to be, them delivering seminars or spending lots of money or whatever it might be. It can be a really quite simple thing, where they send the right message frequently and that will encourage other managers to send the same message to their teams, and then just don't move all the way through your organisation. But often what we find is that, and especially in larger organisations, it always seems to be the change has been driven from the bottom. But often, or it might be driven from the bottom and the top, and there's no meaning in the middle. So, to have both of them, it can be really impactful, filters through the whole organisation.
Yeah, it sets a good standard. It sets an example. It sets a clear message, and people are more likely to listen to higher up as well. So absolutely. So, kind of finishing off with the last part, given the current landscape, it's all still very messy, chaotic. There's all sorts of changes going on in life and in organizations. What still gives you hope?
I think people, the people give me hope. I know there's always so many. At least I find, there's a lot of people in the workplace that are there and looking out for each other, and doing what they can as individuals to support each other. So even if you're in an organisation, I've spoken to people elsewhere in other organisations. Even if you're in an organisation that maybe doesn't have mental health first aiders or doesn't have a well-being policy or a well-being committee or whatever it might be, there's still individuals on the ground that are there supporting each other and looking out for each other. That can be, as you mentioned, exhausting for them to do that. But it is the people trying to change. And I think, for every bad thing you hear about, in the newspaper or a terrible thing that's happening somewhere else, whereas other people trying to do other things. And I think that's really important because it drives, hope that these things can be done and that we are it shows kind of human nature, if you will, that we are also we do also take great joy in supporting each other and connectivity between us. So it's that does give me some hope.
Yeah, it is all about people, absolutely, and it's about it's communication. We have increased isolation and loneliness, not just in communities, but in the workforce and workplace due to remote working. Even hybrid has brought a bit more of that around. So for those of you out there that don't see each other that much, just be more intentional about digitally reaching out and maybe picking up the phone and say, you could send a text and say, do you want to chat in 10 minutes? And so it's how do we intentionally, as people, support each other in this very digital and face-to-face world that we're in, because of that isolation and loneliness.
Yeah, it can also be, I think, quite challenging using digital platforms to communicate because it's quite easy to misconstrue the message. And I find even like you've mentioned, chatting to one of your colleagues or whoever it might be in Teams to clarify that sort of thing can have a huge impact, a huge difference on how it feels that conversation or that ask is going. So connecting that way, yeah, definitely. If you're remote roles, it can be really helpful as well. And it can also be challenging though, because you think, oh, it's easier, it's quicker to send an email than it is to chat on Teams, but it can be beneficial for all parties.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I always think, if you are texting or messaging or emailing, just think in the background, if the person or you both have time for a quick phone call or a visual chat, make a point of doing that in between other things as well. Don't make it all about those text messages that, as you say, can be misinterpreted or just not get the full gist of. I think there's still a lot to be said for picking up the phone, which doesn't seem to be happening as much. But yeah, and people don't answer their phones, which is why I was just mentioning send that not pre-warning, but that pre-text before, are you free for a quick chat over the phone? Because I know now, I don't know about you, Iain, but anytime I phone anyone without an intention that they know I'm going to phone, you don't get people picking up phones anymore.
I get more phone calls from spam people than I do.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also a lot of people that are quite. I find personally, I tend to get semi-anxious when I'm on the phone. I don't know what it is, but I tend to end my conversations quite quickly on the phone. So there is that aspect of it as well to consider. I think some people maybe use things like email and other forms of communication because there's some anxiety about speaking on the phone. Not everybody's like that, but things have changed, as you know, significantly. Back in the day, you could with your friend's house, you could have phone their house in order to do it, whereas you could just phone their mobile phone or send them a text. So things are very different. Right? So it
Yeah,
is something I think might be on the rise a little bit is that anxiety and phone calls and people maybe not being used to it, especially when it's people that they don't know or they work with. I think
yeah,
that's one of the factors that people often emails and texts as well.
yeah. Okay, well, it's been lovely having you, Iain, on the today's podcast, and for everyone else, we will see you next time at the next one.